Most of what's written about running a business quietly destroys capital efficiency, and here's the patterns that I've seen across hundreds of founder-led organizations. If you are a founder watching this, running a business anywhere between $5 and $50 million in revenue, the chances are you've been given the same three pieces of advice by every advisor, every coach, podcast host, and leadership book that's crossed your desk in the last 10 years. The advice is delivered with confidence, it's delivered with examples, and it's delivered without diagnosis, and that's the problem. Each of these three pieces of advice, when deployed in the wrong business at the wrong time, makes the problem worse, not better. Quietly, but steadily, but assuredly, in ways that don't show up on the P&L for 2 to 4 quarters. So, a little bit of quick context before we properly dig in. By execution leakage, I mean the structural gap between what your business should produce and what it actually produces. Given the same inputs, it's not effort, it's not talent, it's patterns in how decisions get made, how priorities get set, and how delegation flows. Now, if you want the full model in 7 minutes, my What is Execution Economics video is pinned to the channel. The link is in the description. Have a quick look through that, and that'll give you all the context that you need. Anyway, over the next 12 or so minutes, I'm going to walk you through the 3 most common pieces of advice that founders receive, why each one destroys capital efficiency when it's deployed without diagnosis, and what the actual intervention should look like instead. So, the very first piece of incomplete and often misallocated advice is delegate more. This is the most common of them all, and the framing goes something like this. Founders are bottlenecks because they hold too much. The answer, therefore, is to push more work down, more delegation, more autonomy, more trust. And if you can't let go, the business can't scale. Well, that framing isn't wrong. In fact, it's a big part of what I install inside leadership teams. As it stands here, however, it's incomplete in a very specific way that matters. So most founders, when they're told to delegate more, they delegate the same things they were already delegating, just more of them. They delegate tasks, but they stay in the altitude of the task. And subsequently, the team member executes the task, but still brings every adjacent decision back to the founder for sign-off. The founder becomes the bottleneck, not on execution, but on every decision adjacent to execution. And this is what I call delegation altitude leakage. And the prescription delegate more makes it worse and not better because it increases the volume of task-level delegation while leaving the altitude problem untouched. So the fix isn't just to delegate more, but to delegate altitudes. Hand over an outcome, not a task. Tell your team member you own this outcome and you make every decision inside this altitude without coming back to me. Or, if the task requires it, at very specific phases in the task. Now, in practice, this looks like effective transference of responsibility, clearly communicating the desired outcomes, briefing and defining timelines, handing over the ownership, and being crystal clear on the stage at which sign-off and re-involvement of the founder is required. So for more complex or ongoing tasks, this typically looks like 10% founder involvement at the very start and then 10% founder involvement at the finish. The delegated member absorbs the middle 90% with total ownership. Now, here's the diagnostic point again. If you've taken my Execution Severity Index diagnostic, which is the 12 questions assessment, by the way, you can find the link in the description, and if your dominant vector comes back as delegation altitude leakage, then more poorly executed delegation makes it worse. If your dominant vector is something else, more delegation might help, but you can't know where the issue actually lies until you've diagnosed it. Deployment without diagnosis, it equals drag. And hold on to that thought. That's a super important thought that I really want you to take home. The second piece of advice, moving forwards now, is to integrate processes. And this one is dressed up. You'll hear it as install the right systems, build the right operating cadence, add structure for predictability, document everything, get out of the founder-dependent loop. Again, not wrong, but processes at the right moment deployed against the right pattern produce leverage. But here's what I see week after week. A founder whose business has stalled, who reaches out for help, has typically already responded to the stall by adding a process or two. They've hired a chief of staff. They've installed OKRs. They've built a dashboard. They've rolled out a new project management tool and the business is still stalling. The underlying reason is usually that they had high levels of priority diffusion. That is to say, priorities weren't just not clearly defined, but were continuously competing with low leverage tasks disguised as priorities. Their stated list of priorities might have been 3, but their actual working list was 12. The team was operating on the working list and the founder was measuring against the stated list. And the gap between those two lists was where the drag was happening. So adding processes to a diffused priority structure doesn't fix the diffusion, it magnifies it. Now you've got OKRs for 12 priorities, SOPs for 9 workflows, a dashboard tracking metrics across all 12. The structure makes it harder to subtract, not easier, because every priority now has a piece of infrastructure attached to it that someone owns and defends. And so the fix isn't just to add processes, it's to subtract priorities. Go from 12 to 3, pause, deprioritize, or end the rest. And then, if you still need process, add it, but subtract first. And again, the diagnostic point, if you've taken the diagnostic and your dominant vector is priority diffusion, then adding processes makes it worse. If it's something else, processes may help. But, same as before, you can't know without diagnosis. Deployment without diagnosis equals drag. Same pattern, second time round. Now, the third piece of advice that I hear often is hire ahead of revenue. This is the most expensive of the 3. And the framing is usually, if you wait until you can afford the hire, you've already missed the window. The founder who scales builds capacity in advance of demand. So hire ahead of revenue. Trust that the right hire will create the conditions for the revenue to follow. And like the others, not entirely wrong, of course, there are stages and patterns where hiring ahead is the right move. But for a business with high systemic execution compression, and just briefly, that's the percentage of your operating system that's working against you instead of for you. For a business with high systemic execution compression, hiring ahead of revenue is a lever that compounds in the wrong direction. Every new hire enters a leaky machine, and the machine has decision velocity problems, signal to action dilution, priority diffusion, delegation inefficiencies, leadership teams with fried bandwidth. And so the new hire doesn't raise the average, they join the leakage and absorb the low standard. They become another node the founder has to coordinate, another mouth in the meeting, another role that needs altitude clarity. Systemic execution compression rises up again, and it doesn't then come down. So the diagnostic is yet again the determinant of this decision. If your systemic execution compression is below 20 when it's scored, hiring ahead of revenue is a viable lever. If your compression is above 30, hiring ahead of revenue compresses the system further before it produces output. So here's a point that I really want to land. Improving execution integrity inside the existing leadership layer unlocks latent value that's already in the system. Often it nullifies the requirement for additional hiring entirely. The maths is asymmetric. A leader operating at 60% execution efficiency raised to 85% produces multiples more output than a new hire onboarding into a leaky system for the first 6 months. And that asymmetry is why working on the existing layer first before hiring is disproportionately high upside. So the right move is to fix the leakage first, then the hire, not the other way around. And again, deployment without diagnosis equals drag. The pattern across all 3 pieces of advice is the same. The advice is generic. Appropriate deployment requires diagnosis first. The advice industry has built itself around generic prescriptions because they sell at scale. But generic prescriptions deployed against specific patterns produce drag and not leverage. So what the actual intervention looks like is this. Diagnose first. Find your dominant vector. Find your compression band. Then deploy the structural intervention that fits that specific pattern. And sometimes that intervention is delegation. Sometimes it's adding a process or 2. Sometimes it may be hiring. Sometimes it's the opposite of all 3. It's subtracting priorities, ending projects, returning altitudes that were delegated wrongly. The point is that you can't know which lever is right until you've measured the leakage, and until you've measured it, every piece of operational advice you take is a coin flip on whether it will compound or compress the business. And that's the recurring through thread. Diagnosis before deployment. Without it, you're flipping coins. And so if any of this is landing, I built a diagnostic which you can run for free. It's 12 questions, takes about 8 minutes. The output is your execution severity index, your dominant leakage vector, and the band that you're in. And that gives you the diagnosis you need before deploying any of these levers. You can find the link in the description. And if you want the full model first, remember that What is Execution Economics video is pinned to the channel. You can check that out. So take the diagnostic, share it with your operating team if you want, see if you all land in the same band. And if you don't, that in itself is a signal worth paying attention to. Thanks for watching.